Welcome to episode 1 of the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're speaking with Dr. Sarah Murphy about the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on our ability to gather, mourn, and say goodbye to loved ones who died during the past year. Anyone who's experienced the death of a loved one during the COVID-19 pandemic understands the profound ways in which the pandemic has impacted their ability to say goodbye and begin to grieve. Gathering restrictions and isolation have significantly complicated grief for millions of people during the last year. Still, there are things we can do to honor the lives of our loved ones and support others who are grieving. Please welcome Dr. Murphy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Holly. I'm really glad to be here with you.
Before we begin, I know our listeners will read your impressive bio. You are, among many other things, a certified thanatologist. For those of us who are not in the funeral profession, could you please explain what that is?
Absolutely. Thanatologist is one of those words that confounds most people, so no worries on that front. A thanatologist is an expert in death, dying, and bereavement. So in addition to being a death educator and professor at the University of Rhode Island, I also do a lot of professional work in grieving and bereavement and mourning.
Wonderful. Thank you for clearing that up for us. You know, Dr. Murphy, it feels longer, but we've had COVID-19. The pandemic has been in the United States for a year now. How have losses during this pandemic taken a toll in this very unique year of mourning?
That's a great question. In some ways, it feels like this has been interminable, like you say, that it's been going on for longer than a year, and yet many of the people I work with have sort of been wondering where this year went. And I think for those of us who have been in a space of grieving, there's this time warp element to thinking about this having been an entire year at this point. But the losses during this pandemic have been unspeakable and unprecedented in many, many ways. People are dying without family and friends being present. People are grieving in isolation in ways that they haven't historically had to do. There's a lot of complications for people who are living through non-death losses at the same time that they're living through death losses. And of course, there's been, restrictions to planning and holding memorial services or funerals.
Can you explain what you mean by non-death losses?
Absolutely. I talk a lot in my own work about the kind of grief that we experience, not only when someone has died, but when we've experienced other kinds of loss. And we don't always recognize our emotional responses to those losses as grief, but they do manifest as grief. So some of the more universally experienced losses that people have experienced this year are also things like the loss of interpersonal contact and having just company around us, being able to hug our friends and family and sit with them and, share a meal and close contact. A lot of people have experienced job losses and financial insecurity, which can certainly complicate not only something like planning a funeral service, but just the ability to sit with your own grief over a death loss. People who have survived COVID-19 have experienced health losses, and there are people who live with chronic conditions of health loss that may be exacerbated right now. We've seen children experience losses in the education systems, including socialization. And I think all of us really, once we really understood that this could happen here and that this was in fact happening here, and we were in some ways closing up shop in our lives, have lost a sense of security and a sense of stability. So whether we've noticed our emotional responses to these losses as grief or not, in many ways mourning has become a baseline state for many people. When you introduce a death loss into that, of course, everything becomes much more complicated.
And you had mentioned isolation earlier as well, and that seems to be a huge factor in this pandemic, both in terms of people who are isolated from the world and people who are dying in isolation. How is that affecting our grief and our mourning?
It's massively affecting our grief and our mourning. When I work with people who are bereaved during this pandemic, whose loved ones died in hospital settings or in nursing homes, one of the pieces that they really, really grapple to come to terms with is the idea that their loved one was ill and died without them being present. And something that I try to reinforce to them that probably provides only little comfort is that dying without friends and family present doesn't necessarily mean dying alone. And this is where we can thank our nurses and our healthcare workers, who are often the last person to hold our loved one's hand. But it does present complications to grief, and it may prompt feelings of regret for not having the luxury of that time together, to finish any unfinished business or to say goodbye or to have a sense of closure. And then when you transition from that, dying in isolation experience to grieving in isolation, it can initiate all kinds of complications to grief because we don't have that public recognition of our mourning that we're used to. We're not receiving the kinds of condolences we might receive if we were still going into the workplace or seeing extended family or planning larger memorial services or funerals. And that lack of public recognition and that lack of social validation can lead to something that we call disenfranchised grief, grief that is not publicly recognized, grief that we kind of feel that we have to grapple with alone. And most people do far better in their grief when they can grieve with the support of other people.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, the memorial services and the funeral services. I was just recently at my first virtual funeral, and it did, it was great. There was a little closure, but it was still different. It's not what we're used to. It's not a normal funeral or a normal memorial service. Are we able to grieve properly, or is that kind of leaving us in a state of limbo?
Limbo is a good term. I mean, I generally don't think about grief in terms of doing it properly or improperly, but certainly there are ways that we grieve healthily and ways that we may grieve unhealthily. And when we are joining or attending a funerary or memorial service virtually, there's a real strangeness to that. We don't feel the sense of normative ritual. We are, again, sort of lacking that camaraderie and community, especially for one of the only people who are streaming in and other people can be physically present, being able to view the body or to hug and comfort other friends and family. And that lack of ritual can certainly complicate the grief, and it can prolong grief, which is not to say that virtual services and virtual funerals aren't beneficial. They're the best that can be done for right now. And I think to some extent that as an option is going to become norm in the future. And we probably always would have benefited from this. For example, if a loved one in another country had died and we literally couldn't get there. But it's really not a replacement for being able to have the kind of services that we are just so ingrained to be used to as part of our timeline of mourning.
Right. And you talked about children earlier. I mean, this whole pandemic, the whole mourning and grieving, this is tough enough for the strongest individual. But what about kids or persons with mental health disorders or people struggling with addiction? I mean, how are they processing the loss? What tools do they have?
Well, I would hope both children and other disenfranchised populations are being supported on the community level, but we know that this isn't always the case. And a lot of us for the last year have had a lot of significant concern and raised a lot of flags over these special populations. Certainly, we should be concerned over the developmental and socialization process for children, especially grieving children, because they might not have that kind of grief support in a classroom anymore, that where a teacher would have been notified and it might have become a learning moment for other children in the classroom about how to support someone who's grieving. And then when we think about the other trends that we're seeing socially, we're seeing massive upticks in domestic violence and other interpersonal violence, people who are forced to isolate in homes where they're not safe. We're seeing probably a trend toward increased alcohol use disorders because the reach for alcohol and the increase in alcohol sales sort of point to that. And we do know that the overdose death rates have been rising since March in alignment with our continued opioid crisis. And as a suicidologist as well, I'm very concerned to see the CDC numbers come out next year about the increases in suicide deaths over this year. So these are populations, and this is a broad span of populations, who, when they are grieving, really, really need significantly more attention, even than the significant attention they would have needed in ordinary times.
And that's frightening. The things that you just said are frightening. And I think that it feels like we're living in a culture of fear. Is that the case? Are we more fearful of maybe death and mourning and grieving now than before?
I think some of us may be more fearful. There's certainly a portion of the population who has moved from fear to acceptance to some kind of denial that this is still our reality. But I think many of us are not maybe being consumed by fear, but have inherited now maybe a healthy fear of knowing that our actions have direct consequences on the health, safety, and lives of the people around us. And not to sound too overly optimistic, but I would love to see that as an outcome long-term of this pandemic, where we have more of a sense that the lives of our neighbors and the lives of our family members are in part sustained by the things that we do. But right now, I think that there is a fear of the future, both in terms of grief and mourning and in terms of these other non-death losses. When can we get kids back in classrooms, and what effect will this have had on them? When, will people be able to get the jobs that they need again to sustain their families and to work? When can we gather again and have the kind of socialization and grief support that we need? And there are continued concerns, valid ones, in terms of science, over the increases we're seeing in real time in COVID cases, in hospitalizations, and in deaths across the country. So when fear becomes a normative state, it's not sustainable forever. We have to reach to what we can to sort of alleviate that, to be able to get through our day-to-day lives.
Well, we will hang on to any optimism that there is out there, so that's encouraging, because so many people have experienced death losses throughout this past year, COVID or otherwise. And like you said, they're experiencing them in real time. What can we do, first of all, to help ourselves as we're grieving in this very challenging time? And maybe more importantly, what can we do to help others?
And those are, I would say, definitely both important components here, because for those of us who are grieving, we know also that people in our lives are similarly grieving, whether they're grieving the same loss or not. And there's a dynamic sort of process that goes into grieving and processing losses for yourself and helping those who are processing their own losses. And I first would say finding resources to help us in our grief is so crucial. And this is something we were talking about, of course, long before the pandemic, the importance of grief counseling, the importance of self-help groups after a loss, the importance of support groups, especially for those who are dying in, non-normative ways, like a suicide support group or an overdose survivor support group. But there are a lot of resources now on COVID-19 related grief, and more broadly, and just as importantly, on simply grieving during this pandemic, whether your loved one died of COVID or not. One of the reasons, of many, many reasons, that I love Remembering a Life is because of its breadth of resources under its COVID-19 tab for people who are grieving in real time, so that they know that they are not alone, and they know that, there is information from experts and knowledge and ways to connect with other people that certainly can afford some measure of empowerment over the direction that one's grief is going.
And these are resources that can be found on the NFDA website?
These are resources that can be found via the NFDA website, and also a lot of resources for the public right on the Remembering a Life website. I was so proud and so happy to collaborate with NFDA and with the Funeral Service Foundation on writing a booklet last spring called Grieving Alone and Together, Responding to the Loss of Your Loved One During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this remains a free resource in print or online for anyone who has lost a loved one during this very challenging year. But Remembering a Life also has a lot of blog articles focusing on the pandemic over the last year and special circumstances for particular populations. Above and beyond all of that, of course, I would encourage people who are grieving to take advantage of telehealth counseling and other kinds of mental health support. Another outcome I would love to see from this pandemic is to finally erase the stigma from seeking mental health support when needed. Even in, again, normal times, and maybe we'll feel that we're in them again someday, so many people are benefited by talking to a professional grief counselor, somebody who is trained and unbiased and not involved in the loss itself, and be able to, help someone as they navigate their way through their grief journey. And with this pandemic, so many mental health professionals have gone to telehealth options that in some ways it's easier than ever to be able to connect with someone and get that kind of support.
Now more than ever, we need maybe some good will come out of all of this challenging time. And so fingers crossed for that as well.
Sure.
We've all heard about the stages of grief. Everyone's familiar with that, the sadness, the bargaining, the anger, the acceptance. Has the pandemic experience changed or skewed that? Are the stages of grief different now?
Well, it's interesting. I talk to my nursing students probably more than any population about this, but the stages of grief, and there are a few different scales of them that were developed by theorists. But the ones that most people know and the ones that really bled into popular culture were by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, of course. And they were really misappropriated in many ways after she was publishing on them in 1970. And when she was studying patient populations that were dying, these were responses that she observed in people who were dying, not necessarily in people who were grieving, but they became transported and sort of an easy go-to for therapists and mental health professionals. And those of us who are working as postmodernists, with an understanding then that there are many different truths and that everyone experiences things differently, know that there really isn't a set stages of grief, and there really isn't a timeline of grief. And that really runs counter to maybe the first 100 years of study and theory of death, dying, and bereavement. But for the last 20, 30 years, we've gained a much better understanding that these stages don't really exist as stages. And while many people might feel these things that you mentioned, denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, that it's not an arc that we're supposed to force ourselves through or that people should be pushing us through. That, really every grief experience in our lives is unique because we are different over the course of our lives and we are unique creatures and we have different relationships with our dead. And similarly, every death loss is going to result in these unique grieving experiences for every person who's mourning that death. So one person might be angry, and another person might feel relieved, and another person might feel sad. And there's really no one right way to grieve.
So there really are no rules to grieving. Everybody's individual, and there's no timeline. You just do it in your own time.
Absolutely. And I mean, that goes back to the idea of proper grieving. And I hear that so much. And I hear it so much from young adults who say, I don't think I'm grieving the right way. You know, when my grandfather died, this is how I felt. But now that my uncle died, this is how I feel. And we're complex creatures. Obviously, our relationships with everyone are different while they're living. Our grief is going to be different for each of them when they die.
So we want to help ourselves, we want to help others, but we are living in a time of social distancing. How do we stay connected when we can't really physically be together?
Yeah, and this has been a real challenge over the year in so many ways, even with those non-death loss ways. And one term, I think we're all using it very popularly now, even though it was meant to be a very clinical and medical term, isolation. Isolation is the worst thing that we could be doing for our mental health, but we use the term all the time, and we're using it whether we are literally put into isolation because we contract COVID or because we're in a lockdown or we shouldn't be out in public. But social distancing shouldn't mean isolation. And when one is grieving, because one generally will do better with some kind of social support, we need to avail ourselves of whatever we can so that we are not, stuck in sort of a black hole of our own isolation. So, using the phone, I'm a proud Gen Xer, so I still talk much more than I text. And, benefiting with technology, using video calls to keep in touch with friends and family who we know are supportive. And that sort of draws the line between what we might feel obligated to do and what we're doing for ourselves. We all know who in our family systems and who in our friend groups is better at talking openly about death and grief, and who is more attuned in terms of being able to listen to us without judgment or without telling us what to do, giving unsolicited advice, or appropriating our losses and turning them into stories of their own losses. So, talking on the phone isn't as great as sitting down over a cup of coffee with someone, but it's better than nothing. And I would say it's a lot better than relying on social media to keep in touch or texting to keep in touch, because at least we are having the voice there. And for those who are comfortable with video calls and who aren't burnt out with work video calls, connecting with a friend or family member across the country or across town and being able to see their face and see their home and vice versa, we know can make a difference.
Right, and have that cup of coffee together over the video.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So then, how are we taking care of ourselves in a healthy, safe way? Because I feel like a lot of bad behaviors have developed over this past year.
Yeah, I think this is reminding me of a conversation I was having back in April, I think, with some of my friends who are funeral directors who were aware, as we all may be, of when we might be trending into self-soothing versus self-care. And it's easy to identify it. It's not always so easy to check it and put the brakes on it. One way I kind of use to differentiate the two is that self-soothing are the things that we do for ourselves in the moment. Mm-hmm. So we feel anxious or depressed or upset or sad or grief-stricken, and we might reach to some kind of act to just make us feel better in the moment. Whereas self-care, if we're experiencing any of those kinds of emotions and more, feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed, are the things that we do for ourselves for tomorrow and for the next day and for the day after that. So while after an exhausting, draining day, it may feel good to sit down on the couch and binge watch Netflix for 6 hours and eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's, it won't be really good for us tomorrow.
No, it won't. Maybe turn the news off and go for a walk instead.
Absolutely. And I wrote about this in my grief support booklet. A lot of the things that we can do for ourselves in our grief right now in terms of self-care are things that I would recommend doing at any time when we are grieving, trying to establish a routine, and maintain it so you can take a little bit of control over your daily life. Trying to eat healthy food and to drink plenty of water. People can become very dehydrated while grieving because they forget to drink water and they might not have any appetite for food. Exercising, even a short walk that adheres to all of our masking and distancing regulations. Trying to sleep, which is even more challenging in these traumatic times when loss occurs, but at least trying to rest. And then there are other things, really, because of the times that we're in, that are more unique in terms of grief self-care. Obviously, following the recommendations of experts to maintain your own safety, yes, absolutely. But also really doing more mental health checks for yourself, taking maybe 5 minutes 3 or 4 times a day to check in with yourself and your feelings, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed by grief, and being able to identify those feelings. What am I feeling right now? Is it angry? Is it tired? Is it upset? Even just identifying those feelings can provide some measure of control in a time where everything seems so out of control. And as you mentioned, news media cannot at this point be just streaming news media 24/7 and thinking that it's not having a profound effect on how we are functioning or how we are grieving, especially because for a full year now, everything we are watching has to do either with political acrimony or with the rising death tolls of COVID.
Yeah, very stressful. Staying at home, it's easy for us to all kind of become a little reclusive, I would think. But do you think it's more important now than ever that we make the effort to talk about our losses rather than holding them inside?
I do. And, bearing in mind that everyone does process their grief uniquely and individually, some people are more comfortable doing more of that grief processing on their own, though most people do benefit from being able to, testify their losses and to share stories about their loved one, and also to share the complications they're experiencing in their grief due to COVID. And what I'm hearing from some families is a sense that they don't have a right to burden other people with these stories when everyone has so much on their plate right now. But opening the door to those dialogues can be really dynamic. It's telling the person you're speaking with, this is what's going on with me. This is just what I need you to bear witness to, that I am so upset that we couldn't have the funeral that my grandmother always wanted. And that's also signaling to your listener that anything they're carrying or holding on to, you're ready to listen to that too. So it can promote a lot of healthy co-grieving, and it can also promote more bonding, really, between the people we care about.
And this pandemic obviously has put a lot of restrictions on funeral services. So many people have lost loved ones, and, some have done the virtual service, or they've elected to not have a service at all, or a small private, everything, the gamut in between. How can grievers honor and memorialize their dead while they're still coping with these restrictions?
There are a lot of ways to continue to honor our dead. As we just mentioned, we need to keep speaking about and remembering our dead. We need to share stories and memories of the person that we have loved and lost. And certainly, speaking from observation and my own experiences, when we lose a loved one, that's a ripe time to start talking about memories that we experienced with them over the course of our lives, because we're no longer focused on fear over their dying process, right? And in that sense, telling these stories and sharing these memories in a very secular, non-religious sense of afterlife, it really keeps their legacy alive for ourselves and for anyone who's listening to these stories as well, that we are carrying these memories as parts of our life with us.
What if someone chooses to not have a service? Say, someone died in June of last year, and they're just waiting and waiting to. Does this prolong our grief if we don't have that service? Does it drag it out?
That's a really good and really complicated question. Remembering that grief in and of itself is our emotional response to loss, I would say that what it's doing is prolonging the mourning period, but also maybe exacerbating our grief. In that, again, we're so programmed for these rituals and we've been socialized for these rituals. So not having the community support, not having the ritual that we're used to in our family can make it seem like our grief doesn't have any markers, that we don't know what to do now. What do we do now if we don't have a service and we don't run an obituary in some cases? Then we have to tell the story of our loss over and over and over again just to notify people that we are grieving. And not having ritual and memorialization now can definitely, for some, one of my students actually put it very aptly. She lost her dad at the beginning of this pandemic, and they have not had a service yet. And she kept saying, I keep feeling like my grief is being put on pause, as if she didn't have the right to feel what she was feeling until they had something where, the community then would signal by saying, no, it's okay to be upset now. And that's really troubling.
And on the flip side of that, some people might have a small or private or virtual service now and something bigger later. So does that just make you grieve twice as much?
No, I don't think so. Again, those grief feelings aren't going to go away. I've actually been encouraging people I work with who've lost loved ones who did have those small services or virtual services to plan on planning something larger for when this is over. I think it can be really, really beneficial to them to go through their grief within their family system and hopefully with support, but then to be able to have the kind of service that they wanted. And I've been saying over and over to people, it's never too late to memorialize our loved ones, whether it's formally or informally. Our love for our loved ones doesn't go away when they die. And it's a very American idea that we have to do this really fast and then move on. But grief doesn't work that way, and grief has never worked that way. So if a service happened 6 months or a year after a death, I think there's something really beautiful to that, because not only are you ushered back in then to this larger community who cared about you and your loved one and your loss, but in some ways, you have all of this time to plan the type of service that you really would have wanted for your life, whether it's, large poster boards with all of the favorite pictures with them, or really working on a lot of different tributes from family members or friends. And, as we all know who've lost a loved one, we're usually only afforded 3 or 4 days to get all of that together. And even in the best of times, sometimes we think afterwards, oh, I wish I had spent more time picking out the music they wanted. I wish I had had more time to work on this eulogy. I wish this person could have gotten here from another state, but we just had to get this done. So I don't think it will extend grief. I don't think it will, double down on people's grief. I think in some ways it would be a lovely way to mark the life and to have that kind of support that physically we don't get to have right now. In fact, Holly, in the 2020 NFDA Value of a Funeral Consumer Study, a bunch of respondents confirmed what we already have held to be true, that attending funeral or memorial services in person is more meaningful and more helpful to paying tribute to their loved one, and that attending services in person lets them feel more connected to their friends and their family. In the same survey, and this really caught my eye, of the respondents who have lost a loved one in 2020 and didn't have a service, 74% of them feel that it's important to have a funeral or memorial service. And speaking directly to that 74%, I would say again, it's really not too late. 1 in 3 said that they wished that they had had a service for their loved one, and are feeling that lower sense of closure that you had mentioned earlier. and having a hard time finding meaning in the loss. It's simply never too late to plan a memorial service because we don't get over our grief, and at best we get through it. And we get through it best when we have these kind of rituals and community support. I would really hope that these numbers and this really helpful survey really reinforce a lot of what we're talking about in terms of thinking about how things may look different in the future, but how really we need to still be planning the kinds of rites and rituals that make us feel good about paying honor to our loved one's life.
And as you mentioned earlier, maybe when we get to the other side of this pandemic, the silver lining might be that maybe we are discovering new and maybe better ways to grieve and might even continue some of these quote-unquote pandemic practices once we are on the other side.
I hope so. And, I so admire funeral directors for all of the pivoting and adaptability that has happened so quickly in this traditional profession. And I know that families appreciate it too. And what families can do for themselves in the future in terms of, putting value again on the funeral, I think is going to be so crucial in terms of future losses, the future, quote, normal, whatever that means, times again, because I think we were starting to trend away from the idea that funerals were important and that these rituals are so valuable until, and of course this functions so obviously psychologically, until it was sort of taken away. And then suddenly we looked around and said, what do you mean I can't do it this way? I want this.
I want to do it this way.
I'm realizing how important this is. And I think that when we get to the other side of this, we're all going to treat funerals with far more import and far more sacredness than we were in the few years preceding this pandemic.
Dr. Murphy, who are you remembering today?
Oh, I am remembering my grandmother today, June Gallagher Yeomans. She died on January 17th of this year, and we were very close, and she was very, very proud of me. I was lucky enough to be the first grandchild of 6. So I was very spoiled by her and my grandfather, and being with her in her final days and being able to be present at a private family service were invaluable for me.
Grandmas are very special, and I'm very sorry for your loss, but I'm glad that you got to honor her life.
Thank you.
Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today and for your wisdom and your guidance in this difficult time.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, Holly.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information about funerals and grieving the death of a loved one during the pandemic, visit rememberingalife.com. There you can also request a free copy of Grieving Alone and Together, the booklet written by Dr. Murphy to help people who are grieving during this challenging time.